Long before the rising of the sun, when only the two trees of Valinor and stars in the sky bestowed their light upon the world, the elder children of the creator Ilúvatar awoke in the lands of Cuiviénen next to the Sea of Helcar in the east of Middle-earth. New to the world, the immortal Quendi, later called Elves, were curious about their surroundings, but also naive to its dangers, and soon fell victim to the Dark Lord Melkor, who held a deep hatred for all of Eru's creations. Ruling from the northern fortress of Autumno, Melkor built an army off the back of his enemies by capturing wayward individuals so he might twist their minds and bodies with dark sorcery to create the violent and savage orc race in mockery of the elves. The primary soldiers of both the first and second Dark Lords, the orcs, were short and sallow-skinned, often weak and craven as individuals, but fearsome and aggressive in a group, eventually populating areas like Mordor and the Misty Mountains. Those great beings like Melkor, Sauron, the Witch King, and Saruman, who commanded the orcs, bred them in various forms to fulfill whatever role was needed, such as the smaller laborers nicknamed Snaga, the mid-sized warrior orcs used as foot soldiers, the Snufflers who excelled as trackers, and the elite Uruk-hai who were faster, smarter, stronger, and more resilient than all others. There were also many half-breed orcs, used as special forces, which resulted from capturing humans, the younger children of Ilúvatar, who awoke in a later age, and using dark sorcery to twist their minds and bodies, as was done to the elves. Although they did not become orcs themselves, these humans were made primitive in mind and body, allowing them to breed with the orcs and create offspring, like the half-orcs and goblin men, who were large, wicked, and cunning. Learning of the terrible fate that awaited captured elves, the Valar of Aman, beings of great power who shaped and oversaw the world, traveled to Middle-earth and fought the war for sake of the elves, capturing Melkor and eliminating the immediate threat. The Vala Orome was then sent to contact the elves and offer them a place in Valinor upon the continent of Aman, also known as the Undying Lands, because it was an enchanted realm of splendor and peace for the immortal races of the world. Yet after their experience with Melkor, the elves feared outsiders and would not agree without proof of Orome's claims. Therefore, 3 elven males were chosen to represent the Minyar, Tatyar, and Nelyar clans of Cuiviénen on a great journey west, where they could witness paradise for themselves before returning to report their findings. Using the island Eressëa as a ferry, the elves Ingwe, Finwë, and Elwë followed Orome to complete their mission, and upon their return described all they saw to their people, which convinced many to make the long journey west, while others still believed it was too dangerous, or simply did not want to leave the lands they knew and loved. Thus, the elves of Cuiviénen were sundered into the Eldar, or people of the stars, who journeyed west, and the Avari, or the unwilling, who remained in the east under leaders like Morwe and Nurwe. Departing their homeland, the original 3 elven clans now had new names and rulers, with the Minyar becoming the Vanyar under Ingwe, the Tatyar becoming the Noldor under Finwë, and the Nelyar becoming the Teleri under Elwë. Though they all started with the goal of crossing the continent and sea to Valinor, the long, perilous undertaking made some reconsider and ultimately abandon the journey. Thus, the Eldar were further sundered when the Teleri clan broke apart in the middle of the continent, with some coming to fear the Great Misty Mountains, believing it represented a border they should not cross. As the other elves continued onward, those who remained under their leader Lenwë became known as the Nandor, meaning those who go back, and lived as relatively primitive tribal forest dwellers until re-establishing contact with their kin in later ages. Having already fractured once, the Teleri again faced crisis when their leader Elwë fell into a trance upon his encounter with Melian, a beautiful Maya from Valinor whose magic affected them both. Frozen in place for many years, the Teleri abandoned their westward travels to search for their lost leader, leaving the Vanyar and Noldor to complete the great journey on their own. After years of searching in vain, Orome returned to give the remaining Teleri one last chance to reach the Undying Lands. Thus the Teleri were further sundered, with Elwë's brother Olwë leading the Falmari or Wave Folk to continue traveling westward, while the Sindar, meaning Grey Elves, refused to leave Middle-earth. Some of the Sindar still hoped to find their lost leader, but others simply came to love Beleriand, specifically the coastal areas. With the great journey at last complete, the many elven factions of the Eldar were now divided into 2 broader groups, the Amanyar, those who reached the continent of Aman, and the Umanyar, those who did not. Among the Amanyar, there were the Vanyar, known as the most faithful servants of the Valar, led by King Ingwe in Taniquetil, the Noldor under King Finwë of Tirion, who followed the Vala Aule to learn smithing and craftwork, and the remaining Teleri, called the Falmari, who lived under King Olwe along the coastline in both the city of Alqualonde and the island Eresea, so they could pursue their love of shipbuilding and sea travel. Yet while the Amanyar elves seemed to be living in paradise, an old enemy was soon let loose, and the peace of Valinor was broken. After his defeat in the war for sake of the elves, Melkor was imprisoned in the Undying Lands, but after a few thousand years feigned repentance and was set free. Allying with the Ungoliant, mother to the race of great spiders, Melkor orchestrated an attack against Valinor, first by destroying the two trees of light, and then by charging into Formenos, slaying Finwë, and stealing the precious Silmaril jewels crafted by Feanor, the Noldor king's eldest son and heir. By the time Finwë's children realized what occurred, Melkor fled to Middle-earth, and so Feanor took up the leadership of their people and organized a journey across the sea so they might take vengeance upon the Dark Lord and reclaim the Silmarils. Yet Feanor, his sons, and closest followers grew so radical in their devotion to this mission, they committed the first kinslaying by slaughtering the Falmari elves of the coast when they refused to surrender their ships for the journey. Learning of this terrible crime, the Valamandos spoke a prophecy of doom for all those who continued on to Middle-earth. Thus the Noldor were sundered, when some few, known as the Amanyar Noldor, followed Finwë's youngest son Finarfin back to Valinor, while the elder sons, Feanor and Fingolfin, led the Etian Goldi, or exiled Noldor, to Middle-earth, so they might wage the War of Great Jewels. Spreading throughout the lands of Beleriand and beyond, the Noldor established many settlements and kingdoms, the greatest of which included Hithlum, originally founded by High King Fingolfin, Nevrast and Gondolin, founded by King Turgon, the realms of East Beleriand under the sons of Feanor, Nargothrond with King Finrod, Dorthonion under Angrod and Aignor, and the later realms of Lindon under Gilgalad, Eregion led by Celebrimbor, and Imladris ruled by Elrond. Leading the war effort against Morgoth, many Noldor warriors like Glorfindel and Ecthelion earned fame throughout Middle-earth, but most of their great heroes traced their lineage to the House of Finwë, with many of his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren becoming kings and great lords ruling over their own realms. Yet, while the Noldor greatly impacted the history of Middle-earth, they did so alongside the Umanyar elves, who never traveled to Valinor and therefore were already well established in these lands. As the Nondor elves lived on the other side of the Misty Mountains, it was the Sindar of Beleriand who suffered most in the war against Morgoth. Divided into numerous subgroups, the Eglath and Lathrim Sindar lived in the kingdom of Doriath under their old leader Elwë, who awoke from his trance to become High King Eleuthingol. Other Sindar who did not live in this realm but still took Thingol as their king were the Falathrim, who populated the havens of the Falas under Lord Círdan, as well as those who settled in Nevrast and Hithlum. Among the many famous Sindar who lived throughout the ages, there was High King Eleuthingol, his daughter Luthien, and grandson King Dior, Lord Círdan the Shipwright, King Oropher, his son Thranduil and grandson Legolas, and Lord Celeborn, who married the Noldor maiden Galadriel, granddaughter of Finwë. Though they took little part in the War of Great Jewels throughout the First Age, the Nondor elves in the center of the continent developed their own culture and history, sundering further into the Sylvan or Wood Elves, who loved the forests and were somewhat isolationists, and the Lyquendi or Green Elves, who defied the superstitions of their people to follow Denethor, son of Linwë, and at last crossed the Misty Mountains to settle in Ossidian. Already divided into numerous factions and groups, there were two more terms that could be applied to the Elven race to further distinguish their sundering throughout history, with those who saw the light of Valinor called the Calequendi or Light Elves, while the rest were the Morequendi or Dark Elves. Originally, this meant the Vanyar, Noldor, and Falmeri were Calaquendi, while the Avari, Nandor, and most of the Sindar were Morequendi. Yet as the ages went on, the term Dark Elf took on a more specific meaning, describing those with more isolationist tendencies, who preferred shadowy forests to open skies, such as Eol, the Dark Elf of the First Age, or the Sylvan and Avari Elves in later ages. Playing a vital role in the history of Middle-earth for thousands of years, it was in the Fourth Age, after the final defeat of the second Dark Lord Sauron, that many of the elves were ready to depart for the Undying Lands, though not all of their kind shared the same fate. Continuing to serve under King Ingwe of Taniquetil, the Vanyar were ever faithful servants of the Valar, following them proudly into the War of Wrath at the end of the First Age. The Amanyar Noldor also fought in the War of Wrath, but otherwise lived peacefully under King Finarfin in Tirion. As for the Falmari of Alqualonde and Tol Eressëa under King Olwe, they suffered greatly throughout the first kinslaying, and as a result greatly resented the Noldor and refused to fight on their behalf during the War of Wrath. Unlike their peaceful kin in Aman, the Etian Goldi lost many realms and leaders throughout the years of war in Middle-earth, ultimately migrating as refugees to whatever elven strongholds were available, eventually mixing and interbreeding with the Sindar, Lyquendi, and Sylvan Elves. Similarly, the Sindar felt the sting of many losses throughout the years of fighting, losing so many leaders and realms. They too became refugees, mixing with the Noldor, Lyquendi, and Sylvan. Formerly of the Nandor, the Lyquendi were led by their beloved King Denethor, and were so upset after losing him in the first battle of Beleriand, they retreated to Osiriand and became isolationists, refusing to participate in future conflicts. Those who survived the fall of Beleriand at the end of the First Age then had no choice but to mix with the Noldor and Sindar refugees to establish the kingdom of Lindon under Gil-galad. Further east, the Sylvan lived for many years as simple forest dwellers, until found by Noldor and Sindar nobles, who created the Woodland Realm and Kingdom of Lothlorien. Ruled by the Sindar king Orofer and later his son Thranduil, the Sylvan Elves of the Woodland Realm remained relatively isolationist, while King Amdir, his son Amroth, and later Galadriel and Celeborn ruled over the Sylvan of Lothlorien, where they eventually mixed with migrating Noldor and Sindar. This left only the Avari of the Far East, who over the years did explore beyond their homeland, yet despite some migrating westward, they rarely interacted with the Eldar Elves, whom they considered arrogant deserters, though some were on good terms with the Sylvan, occasionally interacting and mixing together. Growing and changing in so many ways since first waking in the lands of Cuiviénen, the immortal elves were tied to this world, and while their bodies could decay and be destroyed, their spirits and consciousness lived on until the end of all things. Thus it was that many of their kind began to depart Middle-earth at the end of the Third Age and well into the Fourth, at last taking a place alongside their kin in the Undying Lands. Yet not all elves underwent the journey, with some, like the Sylvan and Avari, remaining behind to live out their days in mortal lands. Unfortunately, without the enchanted magic of Valinor to preserve them, the bodies of those who stayed in Middle-earth did eventually decay and fade away, leaving only the unhoused spirits of the elves. Once the body of an elf passed away, their spirit could go to the halls of Mandos, where the dead rested and might be reborn into a new body, yet this was not mandatory, and so some elven spirits never moved on, and continued to wander unseen across the lands of Middle-earth. A special thanks to all those who contribute to Civilization X, like Soul Guide Medical, Sir Jeremiah Ironside of House Comsia, Sir Dayron of House Ashford, and Chris Walder the Crimson Shadow. If you'd like to help the channel, go to patreon.com/civilizationx, where you can sign up and gain early access to videos, vote on future content, and access the Patreon-only series, Heroes of Lore and Legend.